Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. It's not hyperbole to say that water is the lifeblood of the Valley, but some big changes are in store as the Valley braces for full implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, commonly referred to as SGMA. The goal of SGMA is to bring the state's groundwater, which has been critically overdrafted, particularly in the Valley, back into balance. Indeed, the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California has noted that, quote, the San Joaquin Valley, home to 4 million people, is ground zero for difficult decisions regarding SGMA, unquote. How does the Valley make the transition to an era of limited groundwater pumping? Our guest is Caity Peterson. She's the Associate Director and Research Fellow at the PPIC's Water Policy Center. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark. Nice to be here.
So you've written that, quote, nearly 20% of the Valley's irrigated agricultural footprint is at risk. Are the undesirable effects of overpumping groundwater so bad that it requires that kind of drastic action?
Well, the short answer is yes. So if groundwater pumping were allowed to continue unchecked, meaning we would be pumping more water out of our aquifers than we could expect to replenish in any given year, we would ultimately be facing the collapse of our entire aquifer. And that would mean no agriculture at all, which I don't think is an outcome anyone wants to see. So getting our groundwater basins back into a sustainable balance is essential for the long-term viability of the Valley economy, Valley agriculture, the environment. So it is going to be difficult, but it really needs to happen.
You know, I noted that in your report, you're talking about 900,000 acres of the Valley's 4.5 million acres of irrigated cropland could go fallow. I mean, we're talking huge numbers here. So how much progress is being made regarding the implementation of SGMA?
Well, you often hear complaints that these big regulatory changes are passed into law and then you don't see any real effect of that. But actually a lot has happened on the SGMA front. So prior to 2014, when SGMA was passed, California didn't have any way to regulate its groundwater at all. Now we have groundwater sustainability agencies that have been formed in every groundwater basin that's subject to SGMA. These GSAs, as we call them, have submitted groundwater sustainability plans. So that outlines the projects and actions that they plan to implement to address the undesirable impacts of overpumping in their jurisdictions. And many of those plans have been approved, or at least provisionally approved, and many GSAs are already starting to implement their plans. So we have groundwater allocation schemes that are being put into place. New partnerships are being formed to figure out ways to repurpose land that has to be taken out of production. So we've actually come a long way. That said, there is some pressure to accelerate the pace of these changes given increasing intensity of droughts and other complicating factors.
They're having some problems getting these things passed. I mean, they submitted them and a bunch of them had to be revised. Some of the revisions were accepted, some weren't. The ones that weren't accepted, what happens with them?
The ones that weren't accepted, ultimately, those will be referred to the State Water Resources Control Board. And that's sort of a brave new world at this point. We have yet to see what steps the state board will actually take. But officially, those basins or those GSAs get put on probationary status.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good. Probationary status does not sound good.
So that's something that the Department of Water Resources, I think, would like to avoid in most cases.
Right.
But yeah.
And I think some of the groundwater agencies also, they don't want to be put on probation. Nobody wants to be put on probation. That doesn't sound like a positive thing. So what kinds of alternatives are being considered for the land use?
Well, first of all, taking land out of agricultural production is usually not anyone's first choice for a course of action. Generally, the goal is to keep as much ag land as possible in agriculture. But for the land where there's really no other option, there are a lot of good reasons to find other good uses for that land. So some of the options that are being considered are things like utility scale solar energy facilities. Folks are looking at what we at PPIC call water limited agriculture. So switching our cropping systems keeping the land in agriculture but producing crops with a lot less agriculture, things that can be grown in the winter. Habitat restoration is another alternative. And on a smaller scale, things like groundwater recharge basins and housing, those things could be pretty important locally.
Well, since overpumping is no longer being allowed, can you talk a little bit about what the valley's future is going to look like in an era of water scarcity? I mean, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
Right. Well, now the valley's economy is very heavily agriculture, and it has been for a long time. I assume that the valley is going to continue to be a national and global even powerhouse in agriculture, but the actual footprint of our agriculture is going to have to be smaller. So there will be some right sizing of agriculture that will occur. The portfolio of crops we're working with might shift. We might see renewable energy form a bigger part of the valley's economy and some of its workforce going in that direction as well. So we're definitely at an inflection point right now. You'll see some changes, and as our water supplies decrease, that could impact the valley economy. That could mean jobs lost, depending on what sort of pivots we take to kind of adapt to those changes.
No question, it's going to have a big impact. Well, up next, dealing with the water supply and demand in an era of water scarcity. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. According to the PPIC, today, valley farming uses roughly equal shares of surface and groundwater. Hitting the state's 2040 groundwater sustainability target will require a 20% overall reduction in water use. Simply put, there won't be enough water to sustain the current irrigated ag footprint. Some land will have to be fallowed. Our guest is Hanak. She's a senior fellow with the PPIC's Water Policy Center. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Nice to be back, Mark.
So, as you've noted, there are two ways to deal with this challenge: increase supply or reduce demand. A groundwater recharge appears to have the best potential for increasing supply and potentially could address about a third of the problem. The other solution is to redirect demand by creating markets for groundwater. So what are the options and how would they impact demand?
So first, I'll just say it's not really either or here. We really are talking about both and all of the basins have put a lot of emphasis in their plans on looking for ways to increase supplies. And the most promising new bit of water is capturing some additional flood flows from years like this one that we just went through that was quite wet, and socking that away for use in drier times. There's already been some good progress on that, and more work needs to be done on it. We think it'll be a stretch to get 1 million acre feet average out of that, but there's definitely potential for at least 500,000, and that can make a big difference.
Yeah, one of the things I noted in your report was the worst case scenario, but you've got 900,000 acres of farmland fallowed, 50,000 jobs lost, and regional economic activity declining by 2.3%. These are big numbers. So I'm just wondering, what are some of the concerns about water trading and pumping?
Right. So that's kind of the beauty of water trading as a complement to adding to supplies through groundwater recharge and other techniques, is that water trading, if you allow more flexibility in where water is used on the land, you can significantly reduce those economic costs, both in terms of revenues, in terms of regional GDP, which is sort of a measure of all the economic activity in the valley, and in terms of jobs. And we found that the more flexible you get in terms of trading with both groundwater and surface water, the more the cost savings are really, and you can cut the losses by about 50%.
One thing that I noted in your report also, you're talking about institutional barriers, things like permitting, and the need for really solid accounting and tradable allocations. And you also talked about infrastructure, water conveyance in particular, and dealing with the unintended impacts on third parties. Let me ask you this. How should those concerns about the impacts of water trending and land fallowing be addressed?
So it's really important to address those concerns. And, as you sort of think about, SGMA is kind of a brave new world for folks. Some of the trading that we're talking about is really just kind of expanding what's already done on the surface water side. But for groundwater, it's really new. There hasn't been a system set up to trade groundwater because we haven't had management of groundwater where folks have an allocation, know how much they can pump, and then can get credit for trading it to somebody else. So in order to set up rules of the game that are fair and transparent, and work well is going to require some legwork up front. And it's really important to make sure we're not causing undesirable results in the process.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on that. You talked about the impact on a few things. One thing you talked about is the impact on rural communities. What's your concern there?
Well, there are kind of concerns on two sides. On the one hand, if you are reducing pumping, which SGMA wants to happen in places where there's too much pumping relative to replenishment, you are likely to be reducing pressures on domestic wells and on small community wells because the groundwater tables are not going to be falling in the same way. But that can also increase fallowing. And so you've got to kind of balance, will trading help you kind of move the problem away from where people live, or will it increase the problem where people live? And so on the groundwater pumping side, if trading would lead to increased pumping in those areas, you can set up mitigation programs. You can set up no-buy zones to basically keep people from adding to groundwater pumping. And in places where there's an increase in fallowing, you can kind of look for measures to mitigate the air quality impacts of fallowing.
Yeah, you also mentioned in your report the impact on small farms, dairy, and county reserves, but we're running out of time in this segment. I want to thank you, Ellen, for talking. You can come back a little later on in the program. Up next, taking land out of intensively irrigated production need not spell the end of economically viable activity on that land. What are the possible revenue-producing options? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. As a recent report from the non-partisan PPIC notes, quote, even with flexible trading and new supplies, an annual average of 1 million acres or more of irrigated cropland will have to be taken out of intensively irrigated production to meet SGMA goals, unquote. The downsides are loss of economic opportunity, as well as the risk to public health, widespread land and soil degradation. We're back talking with Caity Peterson. She's with the nonpartisan PPIC. So Caity, to avoid the downsides of SGMA implementation, stakeholders are motivated to find alternative ways to develop other productive uses of fallowed land. One that gets a lot of attention, of course, is solar energy. Is solar development the silver bullet here?
Well, it's definitely an attractive option. I would say short of calling it the silver bullet, but in terms of sunshine, at least, the San Joaquin Valley is a really great place for solar development. There are hundreds of thousands of acres that could potentially be suitable for this kind of use, and many of those acres overlap with where we might see a lot of land fallowing due to SGMA. There is a big bottleneck in solar in terms of transmission, so just getting connected to the power grid and sending that energy from where it's being produced to where it's being used. There is a large backlog of projects in the solar development queue because expanding that grid is very complex, very time-consuming. Workforce development is also a key concern. So the question is, can solar provide the jobs over the long term that agriculture would normally provide, and can we transition some of our workforce from ag to solar? That said, it is one of the more attractive options because of its potential to be self-sustaining from a cost standpoint.
You've also written about planting crops that are less thirsty, things like wheat and oats and barley, and even some specialty crops like agave. Is that an answer?
Well, this is another option that really warrants some attention, especially those cereal crops that you mentioned, because it could be implemented across very large areas and a lot of acres. An important factor here is going to be, do we have the ability to apply just a little bit of water to these crops to help get them started? We're talking much less water than a typical winter crop or summer crop. If you can't do that, they can be quite risky and susceptible to failure. But if you can, it can be a rather high value use of water, particularly when prices for things like hay and forages, feed for animals, basically are high, and when you can keep your operating costs low.
And you also, in your reports, always a lot of numbers and stuff to crunch, but I noted that and when you're talking about these kinds of crops, we're talking about 4 to 8 inches of water compared to what they normally take for irrigated land, 30 to 50 inches of water. So we're talking maybe 15 to 25% of normal, so a big reduction in water use for some of these other crops. So that's a possible option with less water. Another overlooked option is habitat restoration. What are some of the benefits of that?
Well, there's a lot of interest in habitat restoration to try and reestablish some of the value of the San Joaquin Valley for wildlife, for biodiversity, for important ecosystem services that we benefit from. And when we're talking about upland habitat, which San Joaquin Valley is very suitable for, those kinds of ecosystems require very little water once they've been established for a very big impact in terms of adding to habitat quality. The valley itself is the hotspot for species of special concern, for unique critters that you find nowhere else in the world. It's a critical link in the Pacific Flyway with very outsized importance for migratory birds. So any opportunities to expand that habitat and sync that up with land use transitions that are already happening in the valley could provide a lot of environmental benefit for many years.
Now, I want to ask you about new recharge basins being brought online. That seems to be aggressively pursued. What are some of the benefits of that?
Well, as you mentioned in your discussion with Ellen, groundwater recharge is one of the best opportunities we have for storing more water, particularly during our occasional wet years. And setting aside those basins for wet years can have a lot of benefits locally during wet years for improving groundwater levels, for drinking water wells, and for groundwater quality, assuming that it's done carefully. And there's also a lot of opportunity to manage these basins simultaneously as habitat and get multiple benefits out of a basin. So generally, it probably looks like spreading water on farmland for groundwater recharge might be more cost effective in the long run. But for now, these multiple benefit basins can still be pretty important at the local level. Yeah,
it seems interesting. People talk about above ground storage, dams, all the cost involved with that, and we've got just irrigate existing farmland. Seems to be a pretty cost-effective way to deal with the problem. I want to ask you about new housing development. It sounds counterintuitive, but will taking some farmland out of production for housing help save valley agriculture in the long run?
Well, this is one of those things that we assume is going to happen on its own, especially if the San Joaquin Valley population continues to grow, as it was doing up until very, very recently. So acre for acre, housing does use less water than cropland. And we estimate that there are about 50,000 acres of cropland, so small relative to the other uses that we're talking about. That could be really in good situation for new housing development. And that would be something like 175,000 acre feet of water saved per year. That's probably a generous estimate because some of that development will happen as infill, but
yeah, but they could have an impact. Well, up next, we're going to talk about some of the changes and challenges wrought by SGMA, some of the bold action that's going to be required. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Meeting water scarcity challenges now facing the San Joaquin Valley will require bold and sustained actions on multiple fronts. The nonpartisan PPIC notes that, quote, while primary responsibility for developing and implementing effective approaches lies at the local level, state and federal agencies can play vital supportive roles. We're back talking with Ellen Hanak. She's a senior fellow with the PPIC's Water Policy Center. So, Ellen, how can we do a better job of strengthening coordination when it comes to SGMA implementation?
So what's important to realize with SGMA is that folks did their initial planning at the very local level. In most cases, it was multiple groundwater sustainability agencies within a basin, and they did their own plans. And now what really needs to happen is they need to go bigger and cooperate and collaborate within the basin as a whole, across basins. And we also need cooperation between folks working on water, with folks working on land, with folks working on energy planning, because all of those things are going to matter together.
Yeah, I want to ask you, to make this work, what kind of investments are we going to have to make in water and energy infrastructure?
So we clearly want to make smart investments in water infrastructure to make the supply side work. And that probably especially means some additional conveyance to get water to the best places for recharge. That conveyance can also be helpful with water trading. On the energy side, as Katie was talking about, solar is a potentially great option for some lands in the valley, but transmission is a big constraint right now. So kind of getting energy conveyance built is also important.
I was also thinking, when you're talking about conveyance, it's also fixing the existing conveyance that subsidence has caused some problems with. But I want to ask you about some of the things in terms of ways to promote effective water trading. What can you tell us about that?
So for groundwater trading, which is going to be really important locally, basics are getting good accounting systems in place and kind of allocating groundwater so folks know how much they can pump, good monitoring about that, and then systems to credit them if they decide to not use the water themselves and sell it to others, and systems to really put in place guardrails to make sure that trading is not messing things up in terms of causing additional land sinking or subsidence or impacting wells. Same thing with fallowing and making sure that there's mitigation.
Yeah, I think that there are some people that are concerned because it's groundwater, who owns it, where's it going? And I think there has to be a level of trust for this to work, right?
Oh, yeah. And I think, we're in the early days of this if you think 10 years ago, we didn't have anywhere near the information we have on these basins. And since SGMA was enacted, there's been tremendous growth in data and understanding, but we're not at 100% there. And we're still in a learning curve.
Yeah. Another option you mentioned in your report is expanding the knowledge base on water limited crop alternatives. How would that be done?
So think just really classic RD&D, research development, and deployment, diffusion. And what we need here is figuring out which are the best varieties, probably developing some new varieties that can that can do best in a water limited environment. Right now, our winter crops, we tend to put a lot of water on them in addition to the rainfall. So we need varieties that are kind of better for forage, things like that. Market analyses, and getting the information out there and trying it with growers.
Lastly, I want to ask you about what needs to be done to align the regulatory and fiscal incentives with the goals of groundwater sustainability. And what about creating more financial incentives?
So financial incentives, that's easy. There are possibilities for local, state, and federal money to help with this. And I would say we're at a point in time where the more coordination the Valley can do among local actors, the better chances we have of getting some once in a generation federal dollars. There's a lot of federal money available now through a couple of major bipartisan bills that were enacted recently. And then on the regulatory side, really thinking about how to make SGMA work in the context of a whole bunch of other regulatory programs that were already in place before SGMA was enacted. And that means reforms to how CEQA is implemented, how dust regulations are implemented, Williamson Act, which is a way to incentivize protecting farmland, all of those things. And it's not major changes needed. It's some tweaks to just make sure it's all aligned and syncs up.
Well, hopefully we can do that. I want to thank our guests from the PPIC's Water Policy Center, Hanak and Caity Peterson. You want to stay current with state and local politics, you can sign up for the Maddy Daily on our website at maddyinstitute.com. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.